What's up guys, I'm back, and this is going to be kind of a part 2 to the last video where I tested special weapons and adjusted them for Lightfall's damage changes. Today we're going to be doing that, but with heavy weapons. I've got a lot to cover. This is probably going to be a pretty long video, so I don't want to waste too much time. As always, there'll be chapters down below if you just want to see specific weapon types. But again, before I start, thank you for watching. If you like what I do, a like and subscribe are always greatly appreciated. I also stream this over on Twitch, so if you want to catch anything like this live, then check that out as well. And then the last two things are that, like before, there'll be a spreadsheet link down below that'll have the damage values from this video, as well as some extras and some notes. So if you want to catch that, look there. And then the last thing, I guess, I just want to ask, for videos like this that are going to be kind of long, would you rather watch one longer video, or would you rather me split it up into two parts and make them shorter, closer to 10-ish minutes each, instead of, you know, possibly being 20 plus? Just let me know in the comments if you feel one way or the other about it, and I'll try to take that feedback going forward. Let's go ahead and get started, though. First thing, I went over my testing methods in greater detail in part 1, but I do want to mention a couple things here that are specific to this video. Testing and comparing heavy slot weapons can be a bit more difficult than comparing specials. One reason for this is because of how very different heavy weapons can be in Destiny and the different roles they fill. The roles and niches are incredibly diverse here, and some very unique perks exist both on legendaries and especially on exotics. A lot of heavy exotics are completely unique from anything else in the game. So while comparing some weapon types like linear fusion rifles is really straightforward, others like rocket launchers that are being buffed by Gjallarhorn aren't. So for a few sections of this video, I may stray a bit from just giving you the hard numbers that I prefer, but I want to make sure that I explain scenarios correctly, as well as the potential use cases for some weapons here, and that'll probably mostly come into play for rockets, but I'll cross that bridge when we get to the rocket section. And the last thing before I start deep diving on different weapon types is I'll just go ahead and throw some weapons with values on your screen now. These were things that I did do testing with on stream, but I cut them from this video to save time because, believe me, it will already be long enough. They are in the linked spreadsheet though, so if you want to see the numbers in more detail with some notes, compare them there. That'll be in the link down below. We're going to start with linear fusions because they are receiving arguably the biggest change in Lightfall, and they are arguably the best thing right now. Every linear fusion rifle, except for Sleeper Simulant and Queenbreaker, is receiving a pretty significant 15% nerf. And like I just said, linears have been the undisputed king of DPS for a while now, and I'll just go ahead and also let you know I don't really expect that to change too much in Lightfall. The key is in exactly why linears have been so strong. Because currently, linear fusion rifles have both the highest DPS and the highest total reserve damage in the game for any single weapon type. Even the technically weakest end-game viable linear fusion by total damage, which is going to be Taipan, is higher total damage than any other heavy weapon in the game right now, just to put that in perspective. So I want to start by highlighting the total damage and DPS of our adaptive frame linears in the current sandbox. So your Taipan with triple tap and firing line has 1,792,775 total per reserve and a DPS including reload time of 88,971. Cataclysmic, with 4th times the charm and bait and switch, has an absolutely insane 2,650,848 total reserve damage and 107,444 DPS with reloads factored in. For our aggressive frames, which are going to be Storm Chaser and Fire and Forget, Storm Chaser, which I tested with rapid hit firing line, has 2,091,273 total damage and a DPS of 80,617 after reloading, and Fire and Forget, which with enhanced field prep and Focus Fury does 2,555,001 total damage and 68,728 DPS including reload time. Then, once I calculate Lightfall's 15% linear nerf in there, Cataclysmic drops to a still very impressive 2,253,221 damage, and still a very impressive 91,327 DPS, which, spoiler alert, is still basically the highest in the game. Taipan eats a bigger relative nerf because its damage is going to drop to 1,523,859 total and 75,625 DPS, which is still very good, especially for a legendary, but you also have to think Taipan has to deal with the changes to Vice Stinger. The chance to activate Vice Stinger is still the same, but the actual effect is being nerfed. Instead of a full reload, you now get 25% of the mag reloaded. Still good, not quite as good as it is now. Our aggressive frames still perform quite well too, with Fire and Forget doing 2,171,751 total and 58,419 DPS. DPS is a bit lower because of the amount of time it takes to do all the damage. The burst does take a little bit of time to fire, but your single shot damage is a good bit higher to compensate, and if you calculate DPS without reloads, these are very, very strong as well. Fire and Forget also rolls Vice Stinger's 10% chance to reload every single time it hits. So, that's 30% per shot, which is still going to be a bit better than Taipan. Storm Chaser still performs pretty well too. Its damage is going to drop to 1,777,582, and its DPS, including reloads, is going to drop to 70,102. You get a lot of reload speed back from having both Rapid Hit and Bitter Spite, giving you a lot of reload speed. But do keep these DPS values in mind going forward through this video. They're still going to be very strong in the end game. I think it's very important to understand why, and it's really not just because of their high DPS, but also especially their insane total damage. Even if you don't get a whole lot of ammo, for the amount of ammo that you do receive, you're getting a lot of value out of it. So even after these nerfs, Cataclysmic is still among the highest total damage per reserve in the game. I actually believe it still might be the highest. Its DPS is still among the highest in the game, and it's very important to note that the damage meta in Destiny is very susceptible to being warped by encounter design. It's entirely possible that even if linears remain as strong as they are by comparison to other things, that they still end up being very good, because some bosses, take different amounts of crit damage, some bosses don't. Something like Spire the Watcher boss takes more ability damage, part of why Bump in the Night is so good against it, things like that. Just keep that in mind. But just based on the numbers, I think it's safe to say that linears look like they might still be on top, and if they're not necessarily on the very top, they're very, very, very close to it. Definitely not going to be a bad idea to hold on to your linears going forward. The next category I wanted to look at was heavy linear alternatives, and by that I mean essentially just long-range exotics, mostly going to be precision. There's one exception we'll talk about. Specifically, there's 4 I want to talk about here. Sleeper Simulant, Whisper of the Worm, Leviathan's Breath, and Xenophage, specifically when paired with the Actium War Rig Titan exotic. We'll start with Sleeper, because it's a linear, it's already pretty good. So, Sleeper specifically is not going to be receiving the 15% linear fusion nerf, and unlike Queenbreaker, the other linear that is not being nerfed, it's actually half decent, so you might be able to get some use out of it. So currently, Sleeper Simulant hits for 101,614 per shot and has a reserve damage total of 1,320,982. The DPS after factoring in reloads is 72,972. Both the total damage and the DPS are lower than a post-nerf Taipan, but there's a few things that I think Sleeper does very, very well. The first thing is that Sleeper does about 70% of its total headshot damage on body shot hits. Its single shot damage is also about 40k higher than Taipan's, and when we look at single magazine DPS, damage per second not including reloads, Sleeper sits at 132,396 DPS for a single mag, while Taipan sits at 115,883. I do still think Cataclysmic with 4th times and Bait and Switch is probably going to be a good bit stronger than Sleeper, having both higher DPS and higher total damage, but if you've been relying on Taipan, or we see some boss fights with shorter phases of long-range precision damage, don't forget about the potential that Sleeper Simulant can offer. The next thing I want to talk about is Whisper of the Worm, because this thing used to be one of the absolute best exotics in the game, but it hasn't really been used all that much since snipers fell off after being nerfed post-Shadowkeep. Whisper has received a few buffs since then, even if you ignore the useless buffs like this season's aerial effectiveness buff to heavy snipers. So if you haven't touched your Whisper in a while, all you need to know is that the Catalyst now activates much quicker after scoping in, and White Nail reloads 2 rounds from reserves and makes 1 round out of thin air, basically acting like triple tap that also reloads the rest of your mag. Not bad. But the best benefit that I think that Whisper has going for you is that if you do your DPS correctly, you'll never have to stop and reload. With that in mind, Whisper's sustained DPS is 65,914 and its total reserve damage is 1,428,154. The nice thing about that is that that DPS is sustained, so as long as you don't miss a shot and you keep firing, you'll sit very firmly at a value of around 65,914. The only variable there is going to be how fast you're firing. The biggest issue with Whisper, though, is related to its total damage, in my opinion. Because you see, when I calculate the total damage output, I am also taking into account perks like 4th times the charm, triple tap, and in this case, White Nail. So I'm, using the number of bullets I'd get with perfect 4th times, perfect triple tap, or in this case, perfect White Nail. So while both Whisper's total damage and something like Cataclysmic's total damage are both assuming perfect accuracy, the problem there is that Whisper's DPS is only close to post-nerf linears, assuming that you're never going to be reloading. So by comparison, missing a shot with a linear fusion is still a damage loss, true, but you are going to have to reload your linear eventually anyway. The punishment for missing a shot with a linear fusion is just the damage lost of the missed shot. But with Whisper of the Worm, the punishment is both the damage lost as well as having to reload and lose the sustainability of your DPS, because without 3 consecutive precision hits, White Nail will not activate. So personally, I don't think Whisper of the Worm will be worth it going into Lightfall. Maybe if linears are nerfed again in the future, then it could, but for now, I just don't plan to use it at all. The risk is too high for too little of a reward. The next exotic that I looked at was Leviathan's Breath. So again, just as a disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about the numbers on it. I know Leviathan's Breath is having Volatile added to it in Lightfall, but those effects can be very tricky to calculate if they aren't already in the game, so we're just going to ignore it for now. If it ends up being incredibly strong with Volatile, I'll have a follow-up focusing on it, but for now, just know all the damage is going to be a tiny bit higher in Lightfall than the test numbers I have here, because Volatile doesn't add a ton, but it does add a little bit. So Leviathan's Breath does a pretty large amount of damage per arrow, it has a decent ammo reserve for what it is, and the Catalyst does give it Archer's Tempo, which, keep in mind, Archer's Tempo actually has an increased effect on this thing compared to normal bows. Each arrow was hitting for 103,109 damage. You'll see a fire rate of just under 1 arrow per second with Archer's Tempo, so that equates to roughly 100,000 DPS as long as you're firing as soon as the bow is fully drawn. The total damage isn't bad either because it comes out to 1,546,635. So in theory, that works out to be a pretty good damage contender. But here's the problem with Leviathan's Breath. The problem is that it's Leviathan's Breath. It feels really, really awful to use, I'm going to be honest with you. Mostly because of how slow and clunky it feels, and if you miss even one headshot, the DPS goes completely out the window because you lost the draw time on Archer's Tempo, and you really need that to keep up the DPS with this thing. Leviathan's Breath also uses a slightly different draw animation compared to other bows, where the player character appears to draw much faster towards the back end of the animation while struggling to begin pulling the string back at the beginning. So that can make getting the perfect draw a little tricky if you're not used to it. I know you can definitely learn to play around that, but as a result, I don't know really how I feel about Leviathan's Breath. I don't know if I can really recommend it. I probably won't use it all that much unless I feel like testing it out again. I might break it out if I'm a little desperate for some damage, but I'm going to be holding off for now. Alright, so the last thing to compare here is Xenophage with Actium War Rig. Xenophage has been out of the DPS meta for a little while, but it has received some buffs recently that I think are worth highlighting. So for Lightfall, expect it to be able to carry a little more ammo. We don't know exactly how much because Xenophage is very different from every other machine gun, but judging by how Bungie said that low reserve LMGs will get a bigger boost in ammo carried, I think that Xenophage will probably end up getting the 50% buff. They didn't say otherwise because Xenophage does have the lowest reserves of any machine gun in the game. And if that's the case, then you'll be able to carry 42 shots by default in Lightfall, which is really, really good, honestly. And currently, with Actium War Rig, it does 38,222 damage per shot. Keep in mind, Xenophage now actually does some damage on impact. This is the explosion and the impact added together. If you're using Actium War Rig specifically, you'll never have to reload across all 28 of those shots, so your DPS is currently 76,444, and your total damage is 1,070,216. A little low on the total damage side, but the DPS is still good, and the total damage could improve by quite a bit depending on the LMG buff in Lightfall. Assuming it gets that full 50% buff to reserves, the total damage output for one reserve of Xenophage would jump to 1,605,324. The DPS would be unchanged. The problem with Xenophage, though, is that this would only work for a Titan with Actium War Rig. Otherwise, you're going to have to reload, and that takes way too long to do for pretty much every LMG in the game. And with how strong abilities are right now, giving up something like Heart of Inmost Light as a Titan in order to get Actium War Rig probably is not worth it when there's other good alternatives that don't tie up both your exotic weapon slot and your armor slot at the same time. You know, you can get a lot out of something like Heart of Inmost Light. Up next, we have rocket launchers, which I see a lot of people talking about as, damage meta contenders right now. Just so you know, Rocket launchers can be really weird with testing sometimes, with different perks and the way they work being all over the place sometimes. Knowing some of these inconsistencies, I'll also include some basic info on the current state of rockets archetypes, and at the end of this section, I'll mention another rocket that I'm going to skip for the testing portion because of the fact that getting consistent tests are a little difficult with it, just so you know what to look for in a rocket setup, and just so you can know what to expect from this section. Honestly, the first thing to understand about rockets is that each of the rocket archetypes fits into one of three groups that I personally usually refer to as the 90s, the 100s, and the 110s. Now, obviously, those are not the fire rates, which is usually what you expect when a weapon is referred to by a number like that in Destiny, you know, like a 140 hand cannon or something. But what those are is actually the damage modifier that each of those rocket groups gets. For a very long time, all rocket frames actually did the same damage per rocket, and the only variations in damage on rockets was from the fire rate and precision frame rockets having intrinsic tracking. For that reason, precision frame rockets were wildly popular compared to the others. Precision frame rockets basically had 3 perks, while every other rocket only had 2, and if you wanted tracking, you had to give something up. However, in a sandbox change earlier this year, precision frame rockets were given a damage modifier, and so they're what I would call the 90s, because they have a 0.9 times damage modifier, or 90% of the baseline, on them, and that compensates for their built-in tracking, just the fact that they essentially have a free extra perk, they do a little less damage. High impact rockets are the only ones in the 100 category. They do the baseline damage that other rockets do their damage modifiers based on. High impacts have a higher blast radius than the 110s, but do slightly less damage. But in the 110 category, we have both adaptive and aggressive frame rockets, which both have a 1.1 times, or 110%, damage modifier. The other important thing to note is that if you plan to use rockets, then I recommend one player having Gjallarhorn buffing the team. We're going to talk about Gjallarhorn more in a minute, but just know that 1 is enough. You really should not try to use 2 or more. The second thing to know is what perks you want. The problem that rockets tend to have is that they pretty much almost always have to reload after firing 1 rocket, thus reducing the overall damage per second potential. Some rockets are able to get more than 1 rocket per magazine, but you usually have to give up something for that. So let's use my Royal Entry as an example. My Royal Entry has Field Prep and Clown Cartridge, which gives you 9 rockets in reserve and 2 in the mag every single time you reload, but you have to give up a damage perk to do that. Each rocket does 91,037 damage. You have 49,209 damage per second and 819,333 damage total. So let's compare that to an Explosive Light Field Prep Roll of Hothead. You lose the intrinsic tracking and you lose the 2 in the mag, but now each individual rocket does 141,968 damage, and you can still carry 8 rockets in your reserve. Each rocket is doing more than double what that Royal Entry is because of the damage perk. Your DPS with a rocket like this would be 54,603, and your total damage is 1,135,744. You could also run a Hothead with auto-loading holster instead and pair it with something like Izanagi's Burden. You lose a little bit of total damage because you sacrifice 1 rocket in reserve to switch off of Field Prep and onto auto-loading holster, but your DPS jumps a bit because even though you can get more reload speed with Field Prep, you can use the Izanagi's Burden animation cancel technique with auto-loading holster to hide the auto-loading holster time. And if you decide you want that same kind of explosive light auto-loading roll, but with intrinsic tracking, then you can actually craft a Palmyra B with an auto-loading holster and explosive light as well. I will say for the Izanagi's animation canceling thing, you do not need enhanced auto-loading, although it will help with the timing a little bit. You can do it with normal auto-loading. Palmyra's single rocket damage is going to be 116,153. The total damage in a reserve is 813,071. And if you're using this in an Izanagi's rotation, you lose just over 300,000 total damage compared to Hothead, but you might be able to hit more of your shots due to the tracking. It's up to you to decide if you want that or not. I'm not your boss, so I'll just tell you the numbers. You can decide what you want to use. Next, I do want to look at your numbers for Gjallarhorn. Bit of a disclaimer, Gjallarhorn is a little inconsistent in testing because of Wolfpack rounds. The rockets I tested above are going to do more damage with Wolfpack rounds. I did not test them with Wolfpack rounds because of the amount of inconsistency, but I feel that these tests for Gjallarhorn are pretty consistent because they're pretty much going to be based on average calculations, and I had a sample size of 10 tests. Averaged them all together, made sure to exclude any outliers, tests that had really weird numbers, usually much lower than normal, but figured I missed something in there, so So just so you know, these are average values, but they're average with a decent sample size. Keep in mind, regarding Gjallarhorn, that it got a 25% nerf at the beginning of this season. Each rocket, in my testing, was hitting for about 89,043 damage. That results in a total reserve across Gjallarhorn's 7 rockets of 623,301. For the DPS values, I did include Pack Hunter's reload buff because it's built into the weapon and very easy to activate, and the DPS there was 47,113, which that's pretty low for a rocket, but remember, Gjallarhorn is being used to buff up the rest of your team. Gjallarhorn is also in the lowest damage rocket archetype, the precision frames or the 90%. So it's honestly up to you in a rocket situation to decide if using a Gjallarhorn buffs your team's damage to make it worth dropping one player's damage a bit by having them use Gjallarhorn instead of just another high damage rocket. If you do decide to do that, I recommend having them potentially swap to a special weapon in between their Gjallarhorn rockets, that way they're able to get some more efficient damage in while maximizing the uptime of Pack Hunter for everybody else. Not necessarily required, could be useful, you'd have to kind of try doing it one way or the other. The last rocket launcher that I want to talk about though is Bump in the Night. You may see some posts here and there talking about how it's the strongest rocket in the game. I want to clarify a couple things about that. Yes, Bump in the Night with Chill Clip is probably the strongest rocket launcher in the game in certain situations, but I will not have hard tests on it in this video. The reason for that is that it requires Gjallarhorn's wolf packs to make it work, and I wanted tests without the inconsistencies of wolf pack rounds. The second reason is that the stasis shatter damage, which you're going to be getting a lot of your damage from with Bump in the Night, is not always attributed correctly to players in the post screen. So calculating that shatter damage is actually pretty difficult to do. However, what I will tell you about Bump in the Night with Chill Clip is that with one player, and only one player running it, you can get a lot of value out of it. The reason that I say to only use one player is that the stasis, slow, and freeze are debuffs on a target. As a result, multiple players applying slow and freeze do not create multiple instances of slow or freeze. As a result of that, the DPS begins falling off compared to Explosive Light after 2 people are using rockets with Chill Clip. However, with a single one and then everybody else using Explosive Light and then the one player using Gjallarhorn, the DPS is higher than otherwise having multiple Chill Clip rockets. However, I will say, with Bump in the Night Chill Clip with Demolitionist, I will recommend having one player, probably one of your Warlocks because of how strong Starfire Protocol is, use that rocket, again with Demolitionist and Chill Clip. You do not necessarily need the enhanced traits, there's nothing wrong with using them, but if you do decide to use rockets, I would recommend throwing it on the Warlock. I didn't test any of the other exotic rocket launchers, because honestly most of them are a meme, but Wardcliff Coil can be good if you ever find a boss that's not actually coded as a boss, like the Gorgons, or on release the Daughters of Oryx and Kingsfall. Part of the reason Wardcliff melted them so hard is because they weren't actually being treated as bosses by the game, so if you ever find something weird like that, Wardcliff Coil could be good. Deathbringer is okay. Deathbringer is really complicated to use. It's really hard to test. I'm going to stay away from it because honestly, Gjallarhorn Legendary is probably better than trying to use Deathbringer. You're not going to use Two-Tailed Fox, I'm going to be honest with you now. So if you decide to go with rockets, I'm just going to recommend one Chill Clip Bump in the Night, one Gjallarhorn, everybody else probably using Hothead with Explosive Light. That'd be my recommendation personally. The last thing I tested was grenade launchers, because I've seen a lot of people also talking about how heavy GLs are going to be the next big thing in the meta. I can't say I 100% agree, but they definitely won't be bad. They are all getting a 20% buff versus bosses, so the potential is definitely there. Once again, Anarchy was at the beginning of the video when I dumped a bunch of different exotics, same with Parasite. If you're looking for those, go there. This is just going to be the legendaries. And for the legendaries, I just tested the adaptive frames or the 120 RPMs because those are generally considered to be much better than the rapid fire frames or the 150 RPMs. Starting with an Explosive Light Typhon, which, keep in mind, will be comparable to Wendigo with Explosive Light. They're kind of interchangeable here because they're the same frame, same archetype, pretty much the same perks. Single grenades without Explosive Light up hit for 43,494. With Explosive Light active, they hit for 62,079. After Lightfall, your 20% damage buff increases you to 52,193 without Explosive Light and 74,495 per grenade with Explosive Light. As a result of that, your post-Lightfall total damage, assuming that your first 6 shots are properly buffed by Explosive Light by picking up orbs, is 1,182,204 and your DPS is 83,701 with reloads. After you run out of explosive light charges, your DPS is going to drop to 58,643, which is still pretty good. Now, if you're using Wendigo with auto-loading or Typhon with Demolitionist, you can bypass the reload time, allowing you to combine it with something like Izanagi's Burden once again, and increase the DPS a bit overall. You don't have to, but I would recommend either Demo on Typhon or auto-loading on Wendigo. The other legendary grenade launcher that I tested here was Interference 6 with auto-loading and full court. Keep in mind, again, that this with auto-loading full court will match what a Wendigo with full court should be able to do. And keep in mind, at 50-ish meters is where full court provides its highest total damage bonus, which I believe is about 25%, so we tested from around this distance. Each grenade individually did 50,895 damage, which after Lightfall will be increased to 61,074. This results in a post-Lightfall total damage of 1,221,480 and a DPS of 68,315. Unlike the explosive light grenade launcher options, that DPS is very consistent across the entire span of firing your reserves, as long as your distance from the boss stays consistent as well. The only thing that's going to change is if the distance between you and the boss changes, because full court's going to be active for the whole reserve, whereas explosive light is going to be active for only the first 6 shots. However, one with explosive light is going to be a lot better if you have a way to get a lot of orbs during damage phase to restock on explosive light charges. Honestly, going into Lightfall, if I had to guess what I was going to use right now, it would probably be either Linear's Still or Izanagi's Burden with a grenade launcher using either auto-loading or Demolitionist to bypass the reload and doing the Izanagi's, honed edge cancel technique. However, that is all I have for this video for y'all. Again, sorry it's so long. Again, let me know if you would rather I split it up into 2 parts that are half this length, or if you just like the one long video. But like that last video, I'll have a table linked down below with my testing results if you'd like to see those. Once again, if you like this kind of testing stuff, you like what I do, leave a like and a sub. Those are always appreciated. Check out my Twitch if you want. Thank you once again for making it this far into the video. I won't waste any more of your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Later, everybody.